Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Nager, and I'm chair of Reinhart's Food and Beverage Practice. I'd like to welcome all of our attendees here in Milwaukee's office, as well as all of those that have joined us online via webinar. We have a great program lined up for you today, and we hope that you'll leave here this afternoon with keys to family business governance that will help make transitions of ownership and leadership more successful. Our presenters today are Greg Monday and David Sisson. Greg is a shareholder in Reinhart's business law and trust and estates practices. His primary focus is family business law in Madison and the surrounding areas of Wisconsin. David is a shareholder in Reinhart's litigation and labor and employment practices. David solves problems that arise when critical personal business relationships end. Before we get started, I want to take the audience through some quick housekeeping procedures. Our online attendees may ask questions by typing them in the questions section of the webinar control panel. Greg and David will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the seminar. If you'd like to follow along with an outline of the presentation, please check your email inbox. An outline was emailed to all attendees this morning. And for our online audience, the volume can be adjusted using the volume control on your computer or phone. And with that, I'll turn it over to Greg and David.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Gregory Monday.
David Sisson.
And the first slide introduces today's topic. This is going to be a very graphic presentation. We've got a lot of graphics that we think help illustrate the points we'll be discussing. And this first one is kind of the way I visualize a family business. I'm not sure about David. This is how I see it. The roots down there of the tree are really the generations that the founders, the ones that came first. The trunk is the current generation of management and owners, and then the leaves and the branches are those who hopefully will gain sustenance and support and their place in the sun in the future.
That's really good. I hope somebody's recording this.
Yeah.
So let me just jump in here for a second before Greg talks about this next slide to just give you a bigger picture of why he and I came together to talk with folks about this subject. We both come at it from a different perspective. I usually see the aftermath of the problems, the post-mortem, and so I look at these family business issues or challenges and see what people did wrong. And so I try to go backwards and build a time machine and say, if you hadn't done these things, how could this have turned out? Greg, on the other hand, great foresight, incredible tactician. He can see these problems before they get to the stage I usually see them at. But what we hope we can bring here today is just a lot of practical advice. Hopefully you'll find it entertaining. But kind of reflects our philosophy. We work together quite a bit. And this talk is about avoiding problems. And I can give you the litigator's perspective, and Greg can give you, the corporate and family advisor perspective. And hopefully you'll come away with some things that really make sense just on a personal level.
So when we talk about planning and family businesses and governance structure, I like to lead with the positive, the good news, which is that better governed firms have higher operating performance, higher valuations, and pay out more cash to their shareholders. How could you want a better result from legal services? And when we were researching this, we got in touch with this Professor Larry Brown, who does some empirical research on this, because it's hard to get empirical research on family businesses because they're not often public companies, and so they keep their information private. So when we saw that this professor does research on this subject, we kind of jumped at it and contacted him by telephone. And he gave us access to some of his research. It's very interesting. It does present, when you look at it this way, a very positive. In addition, if you even go to, for example, the National Association of Venture Capitalists, they also stress the importance of governance, and they have governance guidance for their members. And think about that. That's venture capitalists. These are people who are investing in closely held businesses. because they want to turn a profit, and they're focusing on governance as well. And they'll tell you right there on their website that companies whose governance, quote, whose governance processes are not in order will likely suffer discounts in mergers and acquisitions negotiations, but that those that are well governed, application of good governance practices, will help build better companies. So if it's good for people who are just concerned about turning a profit, it certainly is good for families who are looking for the long term as well. This is kind of our graphic. This is what I think about when I think of the negative side of the family business. If the governance structures are not in place and if people are not on the same page, it can become very destructive.
That looks really bad.
That's I think that was more than just a family argument, but that's the graphic that I found. So I always think about Hobbes, who was who wrote about the importance of governance, and I have this kind of Hobbesian view, and I think probably David even more so since he's on the litigation side, and that is that when I'm planning, even though I'm looking at the positive, the good news, how much more money everyone's going to make, and that people will have places in the company and all of that, I do think of it almost as, you know, the flip side of that is kind of a Lord of the Flies scenario where people are only out for their own best interests, and that they're kind of following through on their worst selfish impulses. And so Hobbes said, you know, you really need a government in place, or else nothing good will arise out of society. Now, later on, we'll talk about Hobbes was a monarchist, and so his model was not separation of powers. His model was really you put one kind of governing authority in place, and that person will make sure that everyone stays in line, and therefore people will benefit from that. Whereas and I think the monarchy can work with the founder of the business, but
that's a first generation perspective, but even there it can be improved by good governance practices.
And that's not going to ever be a forever thing. And so a lot of times when we're looking at the next generation, either because we're in the next generation or because we're planning for it, we have to talk about the transition from a monarchy to some kind of representative governance. And so the important part to remember about the legal side of things is that it really involves three what are often considered to be distinct areas of law. One is business organizations, the governing documents that create business organizations and give them authority through the state or through common law. Second is contracts law, and what I'm talking about is contracts among family members or among related businesses, among affiliates. And then third are the estate plans of the owners, whether they're in the founding generation or subsequent generations. We've provided materials. This is not a graphic illustration of the materials we've provided. We've condensed it down to about 13 pages, but we could write, I think, something of this length.
Anybody that wants it. So you have a short version of that covers 9 points, 9 takeaways from this discussion, I guess keys of good business governance. So we're going to get to those in the second half of our discussion, but in this first half, we're just going to talk about some examples, I think, that will illustrate the issues and make things a lot clearer when we get there. And it'll start with this. This is our first story about a man named Dhirubhai Ambani, and it's half a world away in India. I don't know if anybody knows who this is, but was one of the richest men in the world and was the Horatio Alger, essentially, of India. Brought himself up from nothing and had worked, part of his backstory is he worked pumping gas and looked across an oil field and saw one of the few oil fields in India and thought, you know, why doesn't India have more? And one day he helped make that happen. And he started out his business in a room that's maybe an eighth the size of this one with just 2 desks and him and his cousin. And that lasted for a little while. It got bigger and bigger and bigger until the point that he was, the head of a $25 billion company, which at various points has represented about 5% of the the country of India's total tax base. So you think about how huge, how massive a business this is, and really has its fingers in everything in India. So as we showed you in the preceding slide, the way that this guy got there, you know, his whole claim to fame is that he's a visionary and he can see things before other people see them, and recognize not a problem but an opportunity. And also, it's always 2 steps ahead of the competition. And that was true. That's how he got involved in textiles and electricity and petrochemicals and entertainment and really every industry that you could think of. So what happened to this man who had incredible foresight, one of the smartest men in the world, died without a will? There's the punchline. Hard as it is to believe, but it happened. And so after building this company up,
I have some theories.
Well, he does have some theories, and I guess I should let him get to his theories. Why, Greg, possibly would this visionary, rolling this up here, die without a will? Do you have any theories?
It's funny you should ask.
All right.
I have some theories. One is that he had no Hummel collection, and so he did not need to divide up his collectibles among his family members, which is
solid theory.
Yeah, it's very common reason. Another is he had no cat, and so he did not need to create a pet trust,
Right.
which are now, since last July, are now sanctioned by statute in Wisconsin.
If anybody's interested, they get some information.
In the pet trust. And obviously, he had not attended one of those free estate planning seminars in Florida. So those are my theories. I might be wrong.
All legitimate theories, in contrast to some of the theories that you sometimes come up with. So he didn't have a will, but he did have these 2 guys, his sons, Mukesh and Anil. The son on the left is the older brother. The son on the right is the younger brother. And as you can see from this column of fire that's rising up between the 2 of them, there's some trouble ahead in the story I'm about to tell you. So these guys were very close, like brothers, you might say. They'd finish each other's sentences. And the guy on the right, Anil, was the playboy, as you can tell, of the duo. Dated some Bollywood actress, and Mukesh was sort of the quiet guy, but they functioned very well together while Dad was alive. But what happened when he was gone? Well, not good things. So in the years after he died, boardroom battles is the first thing, and this is kind of an interesting point as we look at this whole presentation. There was an attempt to oust younger brother by older brother from the company. And it's a public company, and its board of directors, who all had fiduciary obligations, stepped in and said, this is not going to be the best thing for the business. It's going to cause instability. And they were able to keep him there. But, there were some efforts. These guys weren't getting along. Things got so bad, as you can see in 2005, the company sort of split. And half, or a little bit less than half, was left in sort of the core industries, and then things like financial services, electricity, and some of the other related industries were split into a different company. And one brother got one half and one brother got the other. And the only person who could broker this deal, of course, was their mother. So this is literally how the most important company in India got divided up, and all these crucial services that the country depended on were decided by Mom in the course of a family discussion. But they came up with a deal amongst themselves, which is kind of critical for the battles that ensued afterwards. And younger brother had a promise from older brother to buy his gas and oil at a low price that they had set as part of the split that was done. But after they struck the deal, the finance minister of the company said, you know what, this looks like a monopoly and we're not going to let you go through with it. Younger brother said, wait a minute, something's kind of fishy here. I think, finance minister, you're friends with my brother and you're trying to change the deal after the fact by some sort of government regulation. And so things got pretty bad. 2009 was a very bad year. Power outages, and I'll talk about that in a second, court orders, and an assassination attempt that's never good.
I have a theory about that, too, and the reason the reports on the assassination attempt went out of their way to say that
there's no evidence
that Anil's brother was responsible. But in my opinion, if the Financial Times of London reports that somebody's tried to assassinate you, and the next line has to be that it's not your brother who did it. There are some family discord problems.
You might have some problems. So I mentioned the power outages. One of the things that younger brother Anil did was, since he controlled the electricity for a lot of the big portion of the country, he shut off the grid for about 13 major metropolitan areas and let people sweat during a very sweaty summer. And tried to convince them at the same time through his own PR campaign that his brother was really the bad guy. So he took out ads, which are a variation of this. My brother's a big fat jerk. They're probably even a little bit less flattering and, among other things, defame the finance minister and the prime minister of the country. So eventually, the government has to step in, because when you got a company like this that's too big to fail, you can't even let that failure happen as a result of a family business. So they stepped in and said, please, for the love of God, settle your problems and make sure they don't have to sweat anymore. But how bad did things get? Well, here's kind of a graphic example.
Yeah, they still lived in the brothers lived in the same apartment building, but had separate elevators built so that they wouldn't have to run into each other as they were coming and going. So what is the moral of the story? And when we first saw that this was happening, we kind of kept an eye on it, and we thought, Dying Without a Will, this will be really a great story about the necessity of having your estate plan up to date.
But just like good scientists, being good lawyers too, since the results didn't fit our theory, we just kind of revised the theory a little bit here. But now it works perfectly. So Greg, explain.
Yeah, so we looked at the performance of the company, and it really, the company did well. It did not fall apart. It held together. There was the company split, which was professionally handled, and the industries, the businesses that made part of this complete company are still doing well and are profitable. And so why is that, even though there was such disruption in the family surrounding the lack of an estate plan? And the reason is because a portion of the company was traded on the public market, which meant that the company had to be run like a public company, which also meant that there were independent directors, there were conflict of interest rules in place, there was financial reporting. And so what we realized was that it was the good governance of the company that really that saved the company, even without the estate planning. Now, we're not suggesting that you ignore your estate planning if you're a family business owner. What we are suggesting, what we came to realize, was that good governance in the company that you're passing along to the next generation is at least as important and possibly more important, and certainly saved this company when there was no estate planning done.
And looking at this graphic, this is a good one with the hands, but you can also visualize these three elements that Greg mentioned at the beginning of this presentation as sort of a three-legged stool. You have some stability, you can rest if you've got all three things. If you have two, you're teetering a little bit. If you have one, it's sort of like a unicycle, not very comfortable, but you got something. If you've got none of them, you're going to be sitting on the floor. So if you at least have one of these things, that's good, but absolutely you like to be comfortable, and that's why we ask you to look at all three.
Now, Tolstoy, at the beginning of Anna Karenina, said happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I have not found that even happy families are alike. I think that the approach that we take really is that every family and every business, and then every combination of those two, is different. And so we talk about those different areas. There is no off-the-shelf document that somebody's going to be able to give you, whether it's off-the-shelf bylaws or off-the-shelf wills or grantor retained annuity trusts or any of that stuff that is going to be the silver bullet for your family. It really is going to be something that a planned governance, contract, estate planning that is tailored to your business, your family, and that is updated over time to be consistent with the changes. Just for a break, here's another example.
A couple more examples. Now, how do you know if you have family discord? And I don't know if everybody in the webinar can read this, but I'll read it for you. Those folks here probably can't. It's an obituary for Josie Anello, age 94, of Tampa, passed peacefully at home, 2012. She was a loving and faithful wife of 68 years to Vic and Nello, who preceded her in death, and here's the good part. She is survived by her son, AJ, who loved and cared for her, daughter Nympha, who betrayed her trust, and son Peter, who broke her heart. So we can guess at who wrote the obituary. I think you probably know, but these are the kind of things that can happen after a family member dies.
It is kind of just a silly illustration of the fact that sometimes just a death of a patriarch or matriarch does not bring out the best.
But if there was a family business to run the day after this obituary died, you can look at what kind of challenges you'd be facing. So here's another good example, even a better one.
Yeah, well, this is a picture from the greatest movie ever made, Big Lebowski. This is not a picture of the actual event, but there was about 2 years ago, there was an article on GermantownNow.com about a couple of brothers who had to call the police because they got in a fight over mom's ashes, and one of them dashed the urn onto the sidewalk, smashing it to pieces. And by the time the police got there, the family was able to report that they had swept up most of mom's ashes.
And the police report said,
actually the article gave the address of the family.
And talked about when it happened.
It was at I think 9 a.m., which meant that they had started drinking early or they were still drunk from the night before. But these are just, again, silly illustrations that people are put under a lot of pressure when a matriarch or patriarch dies, and that is not the time to start figuring out how the board is going to be composed and how you're going to be making decisions and how much brother or sister is going to get paid the next day for being the president of the company. Now, when we start the planning process, it's really essential for us to remember that a business is not just one company. A business is often a whole series of companies, subsidiaries, technically legally unrelated companies, but that are owned by family members that support the main family business. And so we really like to see this organizational chart at the beginning. And when we do a plan, a lot of times I'll do a business continuation plan that is a roadmap for what will happen in the event of the death of a key senior generation member. And I always like to start with this as the very first page. And then we can look at that and say, okay, let's talk about who works where, what are the contracts among the parties, is the governance going to take place at that top holding company, and then based on who owns what, it also helps the estate planners do their job.
Let me give you a little perspective on the litigation side here as somebody who regularly represents minority shareholders in shareholder litigation, as well as the majority or the company. And so I've seen it from both sides, but in those cases where I do represent the majority, the first thing that I usually ask for is a copy of whatever chart of the family business entities is available, a version of an org chart. In almost every case, my client doesn't have a real good understanding of how everything fits together. And so eventually we end up getting it from the majority or from the company, and only then have an idea of what really is at stake. And so kind of a running theme throughout here, my perspective is to avoid some of these disputes, you want to have transparency as much as possible. You know, there may be reasons why you don't want to share certain information, but everybody ought to have a basic level of education if they're shareholders in the family business. Passive or active, it doesn't matter. You need to know what you own.
This is a theme that we will discuss throughout the presentation. If you can't see the slide, it's somebody being shot out of a cannon. And it's just a point that I feel very, very strongly about, and that is that you always need to plan for exits and separations. And that has some tax implications as well as drafting implications. Also, when you are in a position to help form a family business, or if you are considering reorganizations of family business, the form of the entity matters a lot. If the form of the entity is right, it can make exit strategies easier, and it can also create more wealth for everyone by reducing the amount, by being more tax efficient, let me put it that way. And the state of formation matters. State of formation matters not only with regard to the company structures, but also with respect to the trust structures. One more story.
Yeah, here's another story, and it's a good one. Everybody's familiar with Archie Comics. There's a pretty well-known bloodbath of litigation, shareholder litigation battle several years ago. It took place over Archie Comics, which actually has holdings in a lot of different areas and is a pretty valuable entity. Was run by two 50-50 shareholders, which everybody knows. You know, any person off the street would think, boy, 50-50 is sort of a recipe for disaster, or at least it can be. But the company functioned pretty well for many years, 50-50 shareholders by the two gentlemen who started the company. The dispute started a generation or two down the line when one of the sons of the founders ended up being a 50% shareholder, and then the widow of the other founder took over. She'd been a school teacher before, had never been involved in the business, but actively started getting involved, and the two of them got along for a little while, Jonathan Goldwater and Nancy Silvercleat, until, of course, they didn't, and then things got really ugly really fast, and Jonathan sued Nancy and alleged that, you know, she engaged all kinds of misconduct. She claimed that it was an old boys network and she was cut out of all business decisions. His allegations were very interesting. You know, the kind of behavior that he described included, as it was described here, behavior that would fit in with the movie Horrible Bosses. So she would allegedly ask male employees to pull down their pants, fired employees she deemed too old, fat, or buxom, and let her dog defecate in the office. Those are some of the highlights. She denied it, of course, and had some of her own allegations back and forth, but obviously the whole company got drawn into the dispute. Eventually got resolved, but many commentators observed that this was sort of a blueprint for dysfunction, the way that it had been set up.
Yeah.
And the commentators are pretty interesting.
Yeah, at one point, this was one we followed as well. At one point, it was a $100 million claim at stake. And I saw this article in the New York Times, which I brought to David's attention, this quote in it, I have to wonder how much of a succession plan was in place, said Joanna Draper Carlson, a comic book critic and blogger. Two CEOs can be a recipe for disaster. And what I thought was interesting about this was the person who was giving that wise advice is a comic book critic and blogger. I mean, somebody whose job it is to read comic books and critique and talk about them had enough wisdom to say, yeah, you know, they should have done their succession planning, and co-CEOs is not going to work. So you wonder what was going on with their attorneys and other advisors.
And we recognize that these issues aren't easy in a family business. It's difficult to talk about some uncomfortable questions regarding succession planning, sort of like the same way it is where it's hard to talk about a prenuptial agreement. Uncomfortable conversation, but anybody from the outside can see that there's circumstances where it makes sense to discuss these issues, to put them on the table, and that's what we're all about.
Yeah. So before we get into the 9 keys to this type of planning, we just want to go back to kind of business corporations, LLCs 101. And so I'm using the corporation as a model, that you can set up the same structure or do the same kind of illustration with LLCs or limited partnerships as well.
This is a really cool one, so go ahead, give this explanation.
So first we're going to talk about the control hierarchy, who has the most control to who has the least, and then we're going to talk about the economic hierarchy, and this is in your materials. So the control hierarchy, the reason I show this to clients is because, especially in the first generation, the founder is wearing all these hats, and so thinks of himself or herself running the company as the controlling shareholder. But that's not what shareholders do. And in fact, shareholders don't even necessarily have the ability to vote the shares that they own. For example, you can have voting and non-voting shares. So really, when you look at the top of the control hierarchy, you've got share voting, and that is not someone who runs the company, but somebody who has the ability to make really important, a few, but really important decisions. The share the person with the right to vote the shares is able to elect a board of directors and to remove and replace directors, and then also to vote on major transactions such as changing the governing documents or mergers, acquisitions, selling the assets of the company. That's it. Share voting is often done only once a year, or at the annual meeting, or when a special event comes up, but that's it. Then you've got board authorities. So those who can vote the shares are appointing the directors. The directors don't run the day-to-day business of the company. Rather, they meet 4 to 6 times a year. They oversee the long-range objectives, and they approve budgeting and things like that. And then they can do some very important things as well. They appoint the executives. They can remove and replace the executives. They decide on executive compensation. They decide on dividends or S distributions. They decide on whether to redeem shareholders if shares are offered, or they can also vote to issue more shares as that is authorized in the Articles of Incorporation. The board is different from the person who votes the shares because the board has to act in a group. So directors cannot bind the company acting alone. Everything is done in a group, either by majority decision or supermajority or unanimous vote of the board. So the next level down are the executives, who serve at the pleasure of the board, and the executives do run the day-to-day business of the company, and they're compensated accordingly. And then they will oversee the employees who are serving under their supervision. And then finally, at the bottom, you have the people who have the beneficial interest in the company, who may or may not be able to vote the shares. Either they have non-voting shares, or maybe they are beneficiaries of a trust that owns the shares, or maybe their shares are in a voting trust. Technically, those with beneficial interests are owed fiduciary duties by the executives, the board, and sometimes by the parties that can vote the shares. But often their only recourse when they disagree with something that's being done is to sue one of those fiduciaries. And we know that is a very inefficient way to address the problems in a business. Now, what's odd about it is the economic return hierarchy is flipped. So the beneficial owners of the shares, they own the equity in the business. They're the ones who should receive the profit. They're the ones who should receive the proceeds from the sale of the company. If the company increases in value, they're the ones who will receive that net value. Next are the executives, and even though they were third down in the control hierarchy, the executives are second down here because they are usually compensated better than the board or the voting fiduciaries. They're compensated to be professional executives, and they're being paid usually for full-time services. The board is next. Board members are usually paid board fees. With public companies, they're paid very well, but with closely held companies, especially family companies, board members are usually not particularly well compensated. In other words, they could not earn a living simply by serving on the board of the company and doing their work in 4 to 6 meetings over the course of the year. And then finally, the voting fiduciaries, the individuals who can actually vote the stock, they might not be getting any compensation at all for what they do. So in my mind, this is going back and forth. This is really a nice system of accountability and separation of powers. And so even if one person wears all of these hats, for planning for the next generation, it's really important to break it down and say, when you are looking at who is going to have these roles in the future, who's going to own equity in the company, who's going to be employed in the company, you need to break it down like this and think about it. And it's much easier than to say, okay, we can slot this person in here, and maybe this person's going to have a little bit more equity, but this person's going to get more compensation as an employee, and do your planning that way. And
so that brings us right to the 9 points. We're finally catching up to the written materials that you have. And there's 9. It's not 8 or 7 or 11. There really are 9 things that you need to know. And that's all you need to know. in order to understand good business governance. But you start with the one that's probably the most important.
Yeah, really, and that is knowing the owner's objectives, and that's both the current owners and the future owners. And we have really identified four. One is cash flow, and cash flow would be, for example, in the form of compensation or dividends, or could either be cash flow in the form of installment payments for a redemption when a family member is bought out. A second goal would be wealth accumulation. So maybe you're not so concerned about cash flow. This is really a long-term investment for you, and you are concerned about when you turn 60, you want to sell that stock or be redeemed out, or when you die, you want your family to be redeemed out, but you want what they receive to be much more valuable than it was when you initially acquired it. Third is occupation or career. Family business has this special quality over other kinds of businesses you might invest in, and that is that it provides family members with the possibility of a career or an occupation in the company business if they would choose and if they're qualified to do so. But often they're given opportunities that they might not otherwise receive if they were just putting their services out on the market to unrelated companies.
So you take a real-world example, father with 2 sons and 2 daughters in a business, somebody who's close to retirement. We use this point number 1 as conversation starter with our clients to say what's important to all of you. The question for you as business owners to ask yourself is, if we presented that to the father and the 2 daughters and the 2 sons, chances are each one of them might have a different objective. And if you ask only the question of the first-generation business owner, they may assume that they know what is important to the kids, but that's assuming that you know your kids really well, and nobody knows your kids as well as you think you really do. So bringing people into the discussion and understanding everybody who's going to be a stakeholder in this, what are their objectives? Know that first.
Yeah, so an example would be owning a sports team. We've seen when the owner of a sports team dies, very often a son or daughter becomes the CEO of the sports team. That's not an opportunity that's really easy to get out there, but it represents the ability of somebody to have a career because the family owned the business or have that particular career. And then finally, the fourth point is legacy. And this is the one that actually trips a lot of people up, because these other things are kind of economic decisions, whereas legacy is really somebody wanting to maybe sometimes continuing a business or an endeavor or staying in a business or keeping ownership, mainly because it has family history behind it. It's a 4th generation. They really feel that either that pressure that they need to continue it, or otherwise they'd be a failure, or they feel that they want that special feeling that they can have by being associated with a family that has a high profile of success.
So when you know that those objectives, sort of interest ranking, then you can get to the tough work. You can roll up your sleeves and decide, what do we do with this information?
And then if you work with the previous slides with the different roles that people could play in the business, the different as owners or as members of leadership, then you match that to this list and you start to come up with a plan that can really be tailored to the specific family members. Now, number 2 is seems obvious, but it does conflict a little bit with family ownership, and that is be fair, not equal. Do what makes good business sense. Or this can have extremes, which is what we are trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid the extremes, and the first is resist the Marxist principles, and that is the family member who's not involved with the business but is receiving dividends, and that person sometimes wants the family members who are involved to work harder, produce bigger dividends, push more money out according to his ability, to each according to his need, and that just doesn't work. That's not the right balance. But on the other hand, you can look at somebody who has too much control in running the family business, and then you beware of the fascist tendencies. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
This is the motivation that drives every piece of litigation ever filed, and one of the most important human emotions is fairness. And so everybody's going to have a different conception of what's fair, obviously. But as you're setting up these rules, you want to give yourself opportunity to have a reality check and decide what a third party would think is really fair under the circumstances. Somebody works harder than somebody else, puts in more time, has a bigger stake. They may be entitled to more, but not everything. So as long as you're keeping that as a check going forward, always, is this fair? If you're asking yourself that question at every turn, you're giving yourself the best chance of succeeding.
And these are 5 bullet points that would go under that. You know, are things fair? Do things make business sense? 1, allocate authority wisely. The right people in the right positions, whether they're family members or not. 2, compensate fairly. Have an objective compensation system, as objective as that can be, or at least a transparent compensation system that sets up expectations and carries out those expectations for people who fulfill their obligations. Provide a reasonable return for investors. I don't care that an investor may have inherited their stake in the business. There's nothing in the statutes that says that inherited stock or gifted stock is worth anything less than stock that is purchased for cash. So an investor is an investor, treat them accordingly. Hold managers accountable. The OECD, talking about best principles of governance for companies worldwide, cite 2 things: transparency and accountability. And then in family companies, we often add involvement, not necessarily day-to-day involvement, but engagement might be another way to say it. And then also provide an exit, a way for people to get out of their investment if they disagree with it. The third principle is to use checks and balances. We alluded to this a little bit earlier, and that hierarchy of control alludes to that. And so the next few slides talk about checks and balances within the management of operations. And the first one is about management of operations from the very top. You can see the arrow, base that appointment of management on merit. And we used to have a picture of Aaron Rodgers there as the person who kind of runs the show. And we have become frustrated over time with companies that we do see that kind of overlook their female talent. And so we felt that we were kind of
doing the same.
Yeah, we were doing the same thing.
But it's Aaron Rodgers.
But it
seemed like a solid choice.
It's more of a Wisconsin thing than a male or female thing. But so we chose Angela Merkel as a way to make that based on merit. Don't base it on a person's family relationships necessarily. Don't base it on things that would be considered inappropriate if you were hiring somebody outside the family. Define and limit the role of management. So you can say, for example, a real quick example would be if you don't want your board or your CEO to be able to borrow, to have the company borrow over certain borrowing limits, put that in writing so everyone knows what that limitation is. Use contracts, especially for family members, so that they know what their compensation will be, what their job duties are, and that's also transparent. And then plan to replace the most important members of your management team.
So this is a great illustration of a truly independent and diversified board, the Super Friends.
So we were kind of talking about executives. Now we're talking about the board. And so this is still under the checks and balances. Remember, the executives are accountable to the board. And we really do favor outside independent directors as an element on a board of a family.
So having friends of the family, close trusted advisors that all have the same mindset may seem like a good idea, but it really isn't. It won't help the company in the long run.
So this is a funny slide, but what we're trying to show is people with different powers and what they can bring to the
personnel background, finance background, the obvious things that you would normally pick for independent members of board.
And what people don't understand is that board structure can be tailored. How directors are elected, it does not always have to be by majority vote. You can classify certain board seats so that they're elected by certain members of the family or certain branches of the family. You can reserve seats for family members. You can reserve seats for independent directors.
And what do you do if you have, for example, a first-generation owner who doesn't like the idea of checks and balances?
Then I think the next best thing is an advisory board that then can be almost like training wheels for the family business and the family to learn how to work with the board. And then in the event of the death of that founding family member, that advisory board, then we can even draft it this way, springs into performance as the fiduciary statutory board, so you don't really miss a beat. And then this is just an illustration, again, on checks and balances, that this is kind of the classic setup of a trust that would hold stock. The settlor is the one who creates the trust and turns the stock over to the trustee, and the trustee holds the stock in the family business for the benefit of the beneficiary. So let's say it's minor family members. Under Wisconsin law, you can now appoint a directing party that stands over the trustee and has the special ability to vote the shares of stock and decide on investment and other decisions about the family.
And making sure that everybody, all of the beneficial interests are represented. So the idea of a family council often makes sense for those shareholders who are not necessarily actively involved in the day-to-day operation of the business. Give them a seat at the table, give them a voice, because as I said before, lack of transparency leads to suspicions, leads to discord, leads to litigation. And many of those things can be avoided if you just are a little more inclusive.
And then once you've created your governance structure for, say, the parent company, look at how the other companies, going back to that organizational chart, look at how this translates into all the companies in the family business.
This is, point number 4 is covered a little bit, I guess, in some earlier slides, but it's important to think about it as just kind of its own standalone point. Nothing matters unless it's in writing. I've been involved in many cases where one side or the other is just stuck with a contract. And they may grumble and not like it, but if there's a deal in place, they're like, I guess I'm stuck with that. And so if you want these rules to apply, if you want to create your own constitution, put it in writing.
Yeah, so we're talking about things like governing documents, employment contracts, especially for siblings or family members, and then other insider contracts, including shareholder loans and guarantees of company debt. Those really need to be tailored to the situation.
So here's another visual for you, and I guess a little quiz. What happens when you play Monopoly and you get to free parking? Do you get the money in the pot, or do you just get to stay there? Who thinks you get all the money in the pot? Any of you participants there at your desks should also raise your hand. Okay, how about those who think that you just get to stay there? How about those? I'll raise your hand. So, Greg, why don't you bring this home?
I always learn that you don't get anything, and when somebody first proposed that you get the money in the pot, there was almost a fist fight, and we looked at the rules. I'm very rule-oriented.
We always do the money in the pot.
I took it out. It says right there, not only does it say you don't get anything, it now, because so many people misapprehend the rule, it now says in capitals, you get nothing, this is just a free parking space. Now,
but does that rule have to apply?
It doesn't. You can, as long as if you change the rule in writing and have your family members, initial that. We had our
easy to do. You don't have to even notarize it. As long as everybody initials it in the family.
And then when one of your children gets married, the in-law has to sign it as well. And the rule can be even more specific, such as free parking for dad only. And that's fine as long as everybody has agreed to that and they understand it as part of their expectations.
But point number 5, it seems again really obvious. You want to restrict the ownership group, and everybody understands that as a concept. When we're talking about spouses and other extended family members, herding cats is easier if you only have a handful of them. But it ought to always be in your mind as you're taking off the good governance checklist.
Yeah, and minority owners, even with small amounts of stock, can be disruptive. And so if a divorced spouse obtains some shares in a dissolution of a marriage, even if it's a small amount, they have certain rights as a minority shareholder. And so your governing documents should really have provisions that restrict ownership and that give the opportunity of the company to purchase those shares if they should go outside the desired ownership group.
Number 6 is maybe one of the most important ones. We touched on it again before. We were talking about employment agreements for family members. Have an exit strategy as part of those employment agreements, but also generally. When somebody wants to get out, maybe even as a passive owner, have a vehicle for them to be able to do it. And Greg gives this little example.
Well, before I had somebody flying out of a cannon. On this one, when I was in college, I took four semesters of French, and I didn't learn a word of it. But in the third semester, we were supposed to go see this play called No Exit, and by Jean-Paul Sartre. And I can't even say the name. I'm so bad at pronouncing French.
I like the other titles in the volume, though. We have talked about that. Dirty Hands, The Flies, and The Respectful Prostitute. But we're focusing on
we're focusing on No Exit. So what it was, I went, and I didn't know it was going to be in French, and so it was just 3 people, like in a hotel room, screaming at each other in French. And so it looked interesting. I went back later and I read the play, and it actually was pretty interesting. It was one of those French kind of love triangles where he's in love with her but hates her, she's in love with her but hates him. All of that. And so they really, it was desire and hatred all in these 3 people. And at the end, it's like Hotel California. They're told, this is hell. You can check out, but you can never leave. And that was their hell, was that they were being stuck together with people that they didn't like or didn't agree with them. And the tagline, if it were a movie, would be hell is other people. And it really can feel like that in a family business where you've got personal guarantees out there. You're really stuck in the business because of poor planning. And so these bullet points make the point about how you can specifically address that with plans for exit strategies, either that are chosen or that are even involuntary. Under some
7's a really simple one. Know the value of the company, and this can be handled through regular valuations. And transparency, again, is important. Make sure everybody knows what the value of the business is. Most disputes arise when people have no idea, but they think they heard somebody sold a business that was, around the same sales volume as the business that you're the shareholder in, and they got X dollars, and so I think I should get X dollars. Having a defensible valuation, doing it on a regular basis, if not an annual basis, and distributing that to all shareholders is a way to avoid problems.
I hate to say it, but if I had to choose an advisor services other than tax reporting, I would say the valuation is almost more important than the legal services, just in terms of setting expectation and knowing what people will get on exit. And these last 2 are simple but
related. Obviously, discourage litigation. Hell is other people. If you're stuck together in a year or 2 years of litigation, you have to still work together, see each other, even if it's just a family event, there can be nothing worse, and we have first-hand experience of it. And so relatedly, also in point number 9, consider ADR at every step of the way.
Alternative dispute resolution.
Alternative dispute resolution, and this is a great way, too. Take suits. It's one way. You could build this into your governance structure, but going back to what we said before, put it in writing. Have those agreements in writing too. So if you're going to have a dispute with a shareholder, it's going to be handled first through an attempt to privately resolve the issue. Then it goes to the next step of mediation. Then it goes to the next step before you go to litigation, because people run out of steam. They want to stop fighting at some point. And if you give them enough opportunities to stop, they'll usually do it. So, lost? If you are, that's why we're here for questions.
I wonder how much longer we can use this slide.
Just to make sure that people online can hear me, but we got 3 questions. I'll start with one of them, and if we don't have time to get to all of them, we can always follow up. What if the family plans to sell the business when the senior generation dies or retires? Do these points matter if that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely matter, because in part they'll matter because selling a business usually does not happen overnight. And so what you really have to plan for is preserving the value of the business after the death of an important senior generation member, and how that business is going to be run and maintain value. And also how that value is going to be divided up once the company is sold, and who's going to pursue that process. And also just having the discussion alone identifies sometimes disconnects in the family intentions. I had a discussion with one founder once, and he said the business should be sold if something happens to me because my kids have other interests, they work in the business, but they don't want to run it. And when I talked to the kids later, they said, no, we don't want to sell the business. And I didn't understand that. I said, do you want to run the business? Do you want to become CEO, one of you? And they said, no, but we love our jobs. We love our careers with the company. And so we actually did a pivot on our planning so that it wasn't to sell the company. It was actually to provide for outside board members sooner rather than later who would be able to continue, who they could trust, and would be able to continue to run the business with the family members continuing to serve their roles as employees.
Thank you. And how much does this type of planning cost? Is what on everyone's mind.
How much does it cost not to do it? Usually what I say.
Spoken like a risk management person. Yeah, it's a funny question. We get asked this a lot.
And you can take this in stages. You know, to give yourself a basic level of protection, it will not be expensive to draw up some basic documents, and that'll give you some protection, and you ought to do that right away. Then you can, once you get that done, take a longer-term view.
And I would say, start with the valuation. How much does that cost? And this is a thing that this planning will happen over time. We start out kind of trying to, identify the most important areas to address. Maybe that's in a particular case. Maybe that's the estate planning because the company governance stuff is in pretty good shape, but they really need an infusion of cash if the senior generation dies unexpectedly, and there are personal guarantees and things like that. But really valuation to create the ballpark of what
there's some really cool things that you can do when you have a little more time to be able to do some planning. And obviously, just like any sort of estate planning, best thing that you can do as the owner and parent for your kids is to solve these problems for them so that they don't have to figure it out on their own. And so again, when you have a little perspective, you can do that. But I agree with you. Start with the valuation. Before you think about what you're going to do with the proceeds of the sale of your house, you got to have an idea what it's worth. And unless you have that idea, you may not know what sort of scale issues you're dealing with.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. If anybody else in the audience has any questions, please feel free to shoot either Dave or Greg an email, and they'll follow up. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.